wind howled outside the Frosted Pines Diner, a lonely outpost on the edge of a small mountain town in northern Washington. The neon sign flickered, casting a sickly green glow across the empty parking lot, its hum barely audible over the rustling pines. Clara Hensley, 24 and perpetually exhausted, wiped down the counter for the third time that night. The clock above the kitchen pass-through read 11:47 p.m. Closing time was 15 minutes away, and the diner was empty save for a lone trucker nursing a coffee in the corner booth. Clara hadn't planned on staying in this job long. It was meant to be a stopgap, a way to pay off her student loans while she figured out her next step after dropping out of college. But 2 years later, here she was, still slinging coffee and dodging grease burns in a diner that smelled of stale fries and desperation. The late shifts were the worst, quiet, eerie, with only the occasional customer to break the monotony. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavier, the silence sharper, like the world was holding its breath. She glanced out the window, where fog curled around the streetlights, swallowing the road beyond. The trucker, a grizzled man named Earl who came through every few weeks, was her only company. He was harmless, always tipping $1 more than necessary and keeping to himself. Clara liked him for that. She turned to the coffee pot, ready to dump the dregs, when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face half hidden under a wool cap pulled low. His coat was damp from the fog, and he carried a canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Clara forced a smile, the kind she'd perfected after years of customer service. "Evening," she said, grabbing a menu. "Booth or counter?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the diner before settling on her. They were pale, almost gray, and unblinking. "Booth," he said finally, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. He slid into the nearest one, dropping his bag on the seat beside him. Clara handed him the menu, her fingers brushing the edge of the laminated paper. "Coffee to start?" He nodded, still watching her. "Black. Strong." She turned away, feeling his gaze linger on her back. It wasn't unusual. Working late shifts meant dealing with all kinds of people, some friendlier than others. But this man's stare was different. It wasn't flirtatious or curious. It was deliberate, like he was studying her. As she poured his coffee, Earl caught her eye from across the diner. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question. Clara gave a slight shake of her head, signaling she was fine. But she wasn't sure she was. Something about the new customer, the way he sat so still, the way his eyes followed her every move, made her skin prickle. She set the coffee in front of him. "Anything else I can get started for you?" He leaned back, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. "What's good here, Clara?" Her name on his lips sent a jolt through her. She hadn't told him her name, and her name tag was flipped backward, a habit she'd picked up after too many customers got too familiar. "How'd you know my name?" she asked, keeping her tone light but her eyes sharp. He smiled, a thin, crooked thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard the old guy say it when you refilled his cup." Clara glanced at Earl, who was now engrossed in his newspaper. She didn't remember him saying her name, but it was possible. She forced another smile. "The burger's decent. Fries are fresh." He nodded, handing back the menu. "Burger, then. Rare." She scribbled the order and hurried to the kitchen, where the cook, a wiry man named Javier, was cleaning the grill. "One burger, rare," she called, clipping the ticket to the wheel. Javier groaned. "Who comes in this late for a burger? We're closing in 10. Tell that to him," Clara muttered, jerking her thumb toward the dining area. Javier peeked through the pass-through. "That guy? Looks like he just crawled out of a cave." Clara laughed, but it was hollow. She busied herself with closing tasks, refilling ketchup bottles, sweeping the floor. Anything to keep moving, to keep her mind off the man in the booth. But every time she glanced his way, he was watching her, his coffee untouched. By midnight, Earl had paid and left, tipping his usual extra $1. The diner was empty except for the man, who was still picking at his burger. Clara approached his table, her stomach knotting. "We're closing up," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Can I get you the check?" He leaned back, wiping his hands on a napkin. "In a rush, Clara?" There it was again, her name, spoken like he owned it. "Just gotta lock up," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Long night." He nodded slowly, pulling a few bills from his pocket and tossing them on the table. "Keep the change." She waited until he was out the door before locking it behind him, her hands shaking as she turned the deadbolt. She told herself she was overreacting. He was just a weird guy, probably passing through, like so many others. But as she cleaned his table, she found a napkin tucked under his plate, folded neatly. Her name was scrawled across it in sharp, jagged letters. Clara. Her breath caught. She crumpled the napkin and tossed it in the trash, her heart hammering. She finished closing as quickly as she could, her eyes darting to the windows, half expecting to see him standing in the fog. When she stepped outside into the employee lot, the cold bit at her skin, and the fog was so thick she could barely see her car. She clutched her keys, the sharp edges digging into her palm, and hurried across the asphalt. That's when she heard it, a low whistle, soft but deliberate, coming from somewhere in the fog. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Hello," she called, her voice swallowed by the mist. No answer. Just the whistle again, closer this time. She ran to her car, fumbling with the lock, and threw herself inside. As she started the engine, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot, half hidden in the fog. But when she blinked, it was gone. Lila Carter had always dreamed of escaping her small-town life in Ohio. At 27, she'd saved enough to book a solo trip to a remote coastal village in Oregon, a place called Gray Haven, known for its rugged cliffs and quiet beaches. She'd spent months planning, hiking trails, local cafes, a quaint bed and breakfast with a view of the Pacific. It was her chance to reset, to find herself after a messy breakup and a dead-end job. The first few days were everything she'd hoped for. She wandered the rocky shoreline, her boots sinking into the wet sand, the salt air stinging her cheeks. The locals were friendly, if a bit reserved, and the B&B's owner, a kind older woman named Marjorie, made her feel at home with fresh scones and stories of the village's history. Lila felt free, unburdened for the first time in years. On her fourth night, she decided to try a local pub called The Anchor, a weathered building tucked at the end of a winding road. The place was small, with low ceilings and the faint smell of fish and beer. She chose a table near the window, where she could watch the waves crash against the cliffs. The pub was quiet, just a few locals at the bar and a couple of tourists snapping photos of the nautical decor. She was halfway through her fish and chips when she noticed him. A man sitting alone at a corner table, his face partially shadowed by a fisherman's cap. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd spent years hauling nets. He was nursing a pint, his eyes flicking toward her every few minutes. Lila brushed it off at first. She was used to standing out as a solo traveler, especially in a place like Greyhaven, where newcomers were rare. But as the night wore on, his glances became more frequent, more pointed. She tried to focus on her food, her phone, anything to avoid meeting his gaze. When she got up to pay, he stood too, moving to the bar as if to settle his tab. Her stomach twisted. She thanked the bartender, a young woman with a tired smile, and headed for the door. Outside, the air was damp and cold, the fog rolling in from the sea. Lila pulled her jacket tight and started down the road toward her B&B, her footsteps echoing on the pavement. The village was quiet, the only sound the distant crash of waves. But as she walked, she heard something else. Footsteps, faint but steady, keeping pace with hers. She quickened her step, her heart racing. The footsteps followed, growing louder. She glanced over her shoulder, but the fog was too thick to see more than a vague shape. Panic clawed at her chest. Her B&B was still a few blocks away, and the streets were deserted. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Marjorie's number. "Marjorie, it's Lila," she whispered when the call connected. "I think someone's following me." "Stay calm, dear," Marjorie said, her voice steady. "Where are you?" "On Cliff Road, near the pub." "Get to the B&B. I'll leave the porch light on and meet you at the door." Lila hung up, her breath shallow. The footsteps were closer now, deliberate. She broke into a run, her boots pounding the pavement. When she reached the B&B, Marjorie was waiting, a flashlight in hand. Lila stumbled inside, locking the door behind her. "Did you see him?" Marjorie asked, peering out the window. Lila shook her head, her hand still shaking. "Just heard him. He was right behind me." Marjorie frowned, her face etched with concern. Could be a local, could be a tourist. Hard to say. But you're safe here. I'll call the sheriff in the morning. Lila nodded, but sleep didn't come that night. She lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the windows, her mind replaying the sound of those footsteps. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Evan Walsh had always wanted to work in a Michelin-starred restaurant. At 29, he'd clawed his way up from line cook to sous chef at the Gilded Fork, a high-end establishment in Seattle known for its innovative cuisine and enigmatic chef, Julian Voss. Julian was a legend, brilliant, temperamental, and obsessive about every detail. Evan had heard the rumors about Julian's eccentricities, but he didn't care. This was his shot to prove himself. The kitchen was a pressure cooker, every shift a test of skill and endurance. Julian ruled with an iron fist, his voice cutting through the clatter of pots and pans like a blade. Evan thrived on the intensity, but he couldn't ignore the strange undercurrent in the restaurant. Julian worked late, long after the staff had gone home, and he was fiercely protective of the walk-in pantry, a small room at the back of the kitchen that he kept locked. At first, Evan chalked it up to Julian's perfectionism. Maybe he was experimenting with new recipes, guarding trade secrets. But as the weeks passed, Evan noticed other things. Deliveries arriving in the dead of night. Julian emerging from the pantry with trays of dishes that never appeared on the menu. the way certain regulars seemed almost addicted to the food, returning night after night with a fervor that felt unnatural. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, Evan stayed late to finish inventory. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerators. He was about to leave when he heard a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the pantry. Curiosity got the better of him. He crept to the door, which was slightly ajar, and peered inside. Julian stood before a makeshift altar, a wooden table covered in strange symbols carved into the surface. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows, and a small bowl sat at the center, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Evan's stomach turned, and this wasn't a recipe experiment. This was something else. Something wrong. Before he could back away, Julian turned, his eyes locking onto Evan's. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Evan's mouth went dry. "I was just... inventory." Julian stepped closer, a knife glinting in his hand. "You've seen too much." Evan bolted, his heart pounding as he ran through the kitchen and out the back door. He didn't stop until he was in his car, speeding away from the gilded fork. He quit the next day, ignoring Julian's calls and texts. But the image of that altar haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Julian was doing, it wasn't just about cooking. Sophie Nguyen was 20, working her first summer job at a roadside cafe in rural Nevada. The Desert Bloom was a dusty, no-frills spot that catered to truckers and travelers passing through on their way to Vegas. Sophie liked the simplicity of it, pouring coffee, flipping burgers, chatting with regulars. It was easy money, and she needed it for her first semester at community college. But then there was Caleb. He started coming in a few weeks into her shift, always sitting at the same stool at the counter. He was quiet, unassuming, with a boyish face and a shy smile. At first, Sophie thought he was sweet, maybe a little awkward. He'd ask her about her day or plans for school, and she'd answer politely, keeping it professional. Then things changed. Caleb started showing up every day, sometimes twice. His questions got personal: where she lived, if she had roommates, what time she got off work. Sophie brushed it off, telling herself he was just lonely. But one night, as she was closing up, she saw him outside, leaning against a street lamp, watching her through the window. The next day, she found a note slipped under the cafe's door. It was a Polaroid of her, taken from across the street as she locked up the night before. Scrawled on the back in messy handwriting, "You look pretty when you're working late." Sophie's blood ran cold. She showed the note to her boss, who promised to keep an eye out. But Caleb didn't stop. Over the next week, more photos appeared, tucked into her car's windshield, left on the counter, even mailed to her apartment. Each one was taken from a distance, capturing moments when she thought she was alone. She went to the police, but they couldn't do much without evidence tying Caleb to the photos. "He's just a creep," one officer said. "Stay vigilant and call us if he does anything concrete." But Sophie knew it wasn't just harmless creeping. The photos were getting closer, more invasive. One showed her walking to her car, another caught her through her apartment window. The final straw was a note left in her mailbox. "I know where you sleep. Let's meet somewhere else soon." Sophie quit the cafe the next day and moved in with a friend in another town. She got a restraining order, but it didn't erase the fear. Even now, months later, she checks her surroundings constantly, always waiting for the next photo, the next note, wondering if Caleb is still out there, watching. Clara never returned to the Frosted Pines diner after that night. She took a job at a bookstore in a neighboring town, working daytime hours surrounded by people. But the memory of the man in the wool cap lingered, his gray eyes haunting her dreams. She kept the crumpled napkin with her name on it, a reminder of how close she'd come to something she couldn't name. Lila cut her trip short and flew back to Ohio, vowing never to travel alone again. She couldn't shake the sound of those footsteps, the way the fog seemed to hide something sinister. She started therapy, trying to process the fear. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man from the pub, his face half hidden in shadow. Evan moved across the country, taking a job at a small bistro far from Seattle. He never spoke of the Gilded Fork, but he checked online reviews obsessively, searching for any hint of Julian's rituals. The restaurant was still thriving, its customers raving about dishes that seemed to pull them back night after night. Evan wondered if they knew what they were really consuming. Sophie changed her name and moved again, this time to a city where she could blend in. She carried pepper spray and a personal alarm, her eyes always scanning for Caleb's boyish face. The photos had stopped, but the fear hadn't. She knew he was out there, waiting for his chance. Each of them carried the weight of their encounters, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's a stranger's stare, a whispered name, a shadow in the fog. And sometimes surviving means running, fighting, or simply enduring, knowing that the next threat could be closer than you think.